She never raised her voice. She never reached for a weapon. She just stood there in her scrubs while a uniformed officer pressed her against her own car on a dark Oregon road. And the whole time, nobody watching from the tree line knew they were witnessing the biggest miscalculation of Derek Holloway's life. The woman he was threatening had carried soldiers out of burning wreckage. She'd kept men breathing in conditions that would break most people before breakfast. She didn't need to say a word. But the night wasn't over yet, and before it was done, everything Holloway thought he knew about power was going to collapse around him. Before we go any further, if this kind of story is what you're here for, hit subscribe and drop a like. And tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The fluorescent lights in Havenbrook Medical Center's trauma bay never really went off. They hummed at a constant, colorless pitch somewhere between white and tired, the kind of light that didn't flatter anyone and wasn't trying to. Emily Carter had worked under those lights long enough that she barely noticed them anymore. What she noticed were monitors. She noticed the sound a chest made when it wasn't moving right. She noticed the exact second when someone's eyes stopped tracking and started drifting. Tonight, Bay 3 was running a 42-year-old construction worker with a crush injury to his left forearm, and the situation was messier than the intake note had suggested. The bone was compromised in 2 places, and there was nerve involvement the ER attending hadn't flagged in his initial assessment. Emily had flagged it. The attending, Dr. Garrison Price, had looked at her note, looked at her, and said, "I'll determine that when I have time." Then he'd moved on. She didn't argue. She documented it. She adjusted the positioning of the immobilization, made sure the patient's pain levels were being charted properly, and kept watching. That was how Emily Carter operated, quietly, carefully, with the kind of precision that came from years of doing things in conditions where getting it slightly wrong meant someone didn't come home. Nobody at Havenbrook knew about those years. That was the way she wanted it. She'd transferred to Montgomery 8 months ago with a clean record, a trauma nursing certification, and a rental agreement on a small house near the river. She told people she'd worked at a hospital in Arizona before this. That was true as far as it went. She didn't mention what she'd done before the hospital in Arizona. She'd learned, in the 2 years since she left the service, that the information made people uncomfortable in ways that were hard to walk back. They'd look at her differently, either like she was fragile or like she was dangerous. Neither was accurate, and both were exhausting. So she showed up. She did the work. She kept her head down. The problem with Havenbrook in those 8 months was that keeping her head down sometimes required bending in directions that made her bones ache. The ER operated under an informal power structure that had nothing to do with competency. Price ran the floor through a combination of seniority, volume, and the particular energy of someone who had never been wrong in his own estimation. He had a small rotation of nurses he liked, the ones who confirmed his assessments and moved on, and a longer list of nurses he tolerated and ignored. Emily was on the second list. She'd accepted that. What she hadn't fully anticipated was Officer Derek Holloway. Holloway worked the East Precinct and rotated through Havenbrook maybe twice a week, usually following a DUI processing or a domestic disturbance that had required medical clearance. He was built wide across the shoulders with a close-cropped beard going gray at the edges, and he moved through the ER like he owned the hallway, which he didn't, but no one had bothered to tell him otherwise. He had the kind of authority that came not from being competent at a job, but from being loud and certain in every room he walked into. The first time Emily noticed him was 6 weeks into her rotation, when he'd walked a handcuffed man, 20s, Latino, blood on his temple, into Bay 1 and told the charge nurse the patient had tripped during transport. Emily had been charting at the station 12 feet away. She saw the angle of the man's shoulder. She saw the way he held his right arm. That wasn't a trip. That was a restraint hold applied too high for too long, and the pressure had done something to his shoulder that wasn't going to show up on a surface exam without the right imaging. She'd put it in her observation notes and flagged it to the charge nurse, Brenda Calloway, who was 61, had been at Havenbrook for 19 years, and had a finely developed instinct for which battles to pick. "Let it go," Brenda had said quietly. "His shoulder. I know. Let it go. Holloway files complaints and they stick. Just make sure it's in the chart." Emily let it go. She made sure it was in the chart. The second incident was 3 weeks later. A teenage girl, 17, brought in for a panic attack following what the report listed as a minor altercation. Holloway had delivered her too. The girl wouldn't look at him. She kept her eyes on her own hands the whole time he was in the room, even after he'd gone. Emily had sat with her for 40 minutes after the medical clearance, not asking direct questions, just being present. Eventually the girl had said quietly, "He said if I talked to anyone at the hospital, he'd tell my school." Emily had written every word of it down. She'd reported it to the hospital's patient advocacy coordinator. She'd been told it was outside the scope of nursing documentation and that the coordinator would follow up with the appropriate parties. She never heard anything else about it. The night everything shifted started quietly. Emily had pulled a double, her day shift running long due to a multi-car collision on Route 9 that had sent 4 patients to trauma in quick succession. And by the time the second shift was winding down past 11, the ER had settled into that particular late-night register that was less chaotic and more relentless. The cases were slower to arrive but heavier to carry. She was at the nursing station updating discharge paperwork when the doors came open and Holloway walked in with a man she didn't recognize, someone in civilian clothes with a posture that said military or law enforcement. She wasn't sure which. They were mid-conversation, and Holloway was clearly in a good mood, which always made him louder. He dropped a chart on the desk in front of Brenda Calloway. "Processing a detainee for clearance. Superficial laceration? Make it fast." Brenda took the chart without comment. Emily kept her eyes on her own screen. The detainee, a man in his early 30s, heavy-set, with a cut above his eyebrow that was still seeping, sat down in the chair Holloway indicated. He wasn't cuffed. Emily noticed that. Not restrained, so either pre-arrest or cleared already, which meant Holloway was here more as transport than as arresting officer. The man's hands were shaking slightly, not the kind of shaking that came from drugs or alcohol, but the finer tremor of someone who was scared and trying not to show it. Price appeared from the back hallway, already pulling on his jacket. He looked at the intake chair and then at Brenda. "Who's picking this one up?" "I've got him," Emily said. Price looked at her. "Don't take long. You've got a discharge in Bay 2. "I know. This'll be quick." She took the chart, pulled her kit, and went to the intake chair. Holloway had moved to the side wall and was scrolling his phone, only half paying attention. The man with him had disappeared into the hallway. Emily crouched to eye level with the detainee, which she always did because looking down at someone sitting changed the quality of the conversation in ways that weren't useful. "I'm Emily. I'm going to look at your forehead, okay? Can you tell me how this happened?" The man glanced sideways toward Holloway, a quick involuntary look, before he said, "Fell." "Okay." She put on gloves. The laceration was clean at the edges, about 2 centimeters superficial. It had bled more than it had hurt, probably. But there was bruising around his left eye socket that was older, 2 or 3 days, the coloration in the yellow-purple range, and that hadn't come from tonight. "This bruising here," she said, keeping her voice completely neutral, "that's from before tonight?" He nodded, barely. She kept working. She was cleaning the wound, prepping a small adhesive closure strip, charting as she went, routine, clean. She wasn't going to push, but she was going to document every single thing she could see. "His arm," the detainee said suddenly, very quietly. She looked up. "My arm. My right one. I can't really—" He stopped, rolled his shoulder slightly, and winced. Emily moved to his right side. She didn't ask permission from Holloway, who wasn't the patient's physician and had no medical authority in this bay. She examined the arm. The range of motion was limited at the shoulder. There was tenderness along the rotator cuff line when she palpated gently. "I'm going to order an X-ray of this shoulder," she said clearly, loud enough for the room. Holloway looked up from his phone. "He doesn't need an X-ray. He's being cleared and released. I'm seeing reduced ROM and point tenderness consistent with a possible rotator cuff injury. That needs imaging." "He fell." Holloway's voice had taken on a particular flatness, the kind that was a warning dressed up as a statement. "I understand that's in the report," Emily said, "but clinically, this warrants imaging before I can clear him." There was a beat of silence. Price, who had reappeared somewhere behind her, was very still. Holloway put his phone in his pocket and walked toward the bay. He stopped at the edge of the curtain line, which was technically the boundary of the patient care area, and he held there. "You're overcomplicating a 30-minute clearance, Carter. Don't." She looked at him for 1 second. "I'm doing a clinical assessment, officer. That's my job." "Your job is to clear him and send him back with me." "My job," she said, still even, is to provide appropriate medical care to everyone who comes through this ER, regardless of who brought them in. The silence in the bay had a texture to it now. Brenda had gone very still at the station. Price was watching without intervening. The detainee was looking at his lap. Holloway said very quietly, "You're going to want to check yourself." Emily didn't answer. She turned back to her patient and ordered the imaging. Holloway left without another word. She heard him in the hallway, talking to someone, his voice low and controlled. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She knew that tone. She'd been in rooms with men who used that tone, usually right before something got a lot more complicated. Price appeared at her elbow when the patient had been taken for imaging. "You know that was unnecessary." "The imaging?" "The confrontation." She considered that for a moment. "I documented a clinical finding. I ordered appropriate imaging. If that constitutes a confrontation, that's not really a clinical problem." "He's going to file something. Let him." Price looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't quite trust. Then he walked away. The imaging came back 45 minutes later. Partial tear of the supraspinatus tendon. It wasn't from falling. The angle and the nature of the injury were consistent with a forced restraint hold applied upward and backward, the kind that came from an aggressive takedown where the person resisting was twisted rather than simply taken to the ground. Emily documented all of it, flagged it for the patient advocate, and cleared the patient with a referral for orthopedic follow-up. She explained his options to him directly, with Holloway out of the room, and she wrote her personal number on the back of a hospital card. Not protocol, but she'd stopped caring about that particular protocol 30 minutes ago. The detainee took the card without looking at it, but he took it. She clocked out at 12:40. She walked to her car, a 9-year-old Subaru with a cracked rear taillight she kept meaning to fix, in the north lot under the halogen lights that always made the asphalt look vaguely radioactive. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before she started the engine, doing the thing she'd taught herself in the years since she left the service, the 30-second inventory. Not a meditation, not a ritual, just a check. Hands, breath, position. She was tired. She was also not particularly surprised by anything that had happened. That was maybe the saddest part. She pulled out of the lot and headed south on Meridian, which would take her along the river road toward her rental house. The road was empty at this hour, the kind of empty that felt like a held breath. Trees pressing in on both sides and the occasional light from a house set back from the shoulder. She saw the cruiser's lights before she processed what they meant. Blue and white in her rear view, the pulse of it bouncing off the tree trunks. She checked her speed. She was at 34 in a 35, and pulled to the shoulder because that's what you did, automatically, even when you already knew something was off. The cruiser stopped behind her. The lights stayed on. She put her window down and waited, keeping both hands on the wheel. It was 40 seconds before the officer's door opened. She watched in the side mirror. The walk was familiar before she could see the face. Holloway. He came to her window and stood slightly behind the frame, which was a position that had nothing to do with traffic stops and everything to do with controlling the sight line of the person in the car. She had the brief, absurd thought that whoever had trained him had at least taught him something. License and registration. She got them. She handed them over without comment. He took longer than necessary looking at them. "Do you know why I stopped you?" "No." "You failed to come to a complete stop at the intersection of Meridian and Culver." She hadn't. There was no stop sign at Meridian and Culver. She knew that road well enough to drive it half asleep. But she said, "I understand, because that was also the thing you did, and because she was already thinking about something else." "Step out of the vehicle." She looked at him then. "Is there a reason for that?" "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." She got out. She stood on the shoulder with the gravel cold through her sneakers and the river smell coming off the dark, somewhere to her left, and she watched him without expression while he shone his flashlight into her window without asking permission, which was already, legally, clearly, wrong. "I'd like to know why you're looking into my vehicle," she said. "Routine check." "A routine check requires cause. I haven't consented to a search." Holloway turned from the window and looked at her. In the splash of the cruiser's lights, his expression was composed, which was more unsettling than if he'd been angry. He'd already moved past anger into something more methodical. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I'm aware of my rights. You caused trouble at my scene tonight, and now you want to talk about rights. He shook his head slightly, like she was something mildly disappointing. You really don't understand how this works, do you, Carter? There are people in this county who have goodwill, and there are people who spend it. You spent yours tonight. He took a step closer. You're just a nurse. That's all you are. And in this county, that means you stay in your lane. Emily held his gaze. Her hands were at her sides. Her heartbeat was even. Not artificially calm, not suppressed, just genuinely measured, the way it had learned to be over years of situations where panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was aware of everything at once, the temperature of the air, the sound of the cruiser's engine, the distance between her body and his, the exact angle of the flashlight. All of it was just data. She collected data. I'd like to call my attorney, she said. You can do that from the station. Am I being detained? A pause. 1 second. 2. Not yet. Then I'm going to get back in my vehicle. He stepped into her path. Not dramatically, just slightly. Just enough. That was the moment. She recognized it. Not as a physical threat precisely, but as a statement. He was telling her something with his body that he hadn't said yet with his mouth. She'd been in situations like this before, in places where the stakes had been considerably more life-altering, and the calculation she'd learned in those situations was the same one she was running now. What does this person actually have? What are they willing to use, and what does responding cost you? Officer Holloway, she said, and her voice had gone to a register she didn't use at Havenbrook, something steadier and more specific. I've been documenting this stop since you activated your lights. My phone is on the dashboard, and the audio is running. I have not consented to any search. I have committed no violation that you've been able to describe. If you have grounds to detain me, state them. If you don't, I'm leaving. Something shifted in his face. Not fear, calculation. He stepped back, barely. She walked to her door, got in, started the engine. She didn't look at him in the mirror as she pulled onto the road. She kept her hands at 10 and 2, and she drove exactly 33 miles per hour all the way to the next intersection. Her phone, screened down on the dashboard, had been recording for 4 minutes and 17 seconds before she'd mentioned it out loud. She drove another mile before she pulled into a gas station lot and sat for a moment with the engine running. Her heart was still even. Her hands weren't shaking. She was aware somewhere behind the practical surface of her thoughts of a particular kind of anger. Not hot, not urgent, the kind that had been compressing slowly over months, and was now reaching a density that had different properties than the softer versions. She'd felt it before, in different places, for different reasons. She picked up her phone and looked at the recording. 4 minutes, 40 seconds. She didn't play it back. She already knew what was on it. She pulled up a secure cloud account she'd kept since her service days, the kind that automatically backed up anything she uploaded and timestamped it on a server she didn't control. She uploaded the file. She added a note with the date, time, location, badge number she'd seen on his uniform in the mirror, and the plate of the cruiser. Then she put the phone in her bag, pulled back onto the road, and drove home. Her house was dark when she got there. She let herself in, fed the cat she'd adopted 3 months ago and hadn't quite gotten around to naming. She called him Gray, which wasn't a name, just a description, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water. The documentation she had was useful. The audio was clear. The detail about the shoulder injury, the prior incidents with the teenage girl and the handcuffed man, the pattern. It was building into something that wouldn't be easy to dismiss if she could get it in front of the right people. The problem with getting it in front of the right people was knowing who those people were in a county where Holloway's relationships clearly ran deep. The hospital hadn't done anything. The patient advocacy coordinator had done nothing. Filing with the precinct itself was, in her assessment, about as useful as reporting a problem to the problem. She was still working through that particular knot when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. Unfamiliar number, but the content made her still. MS Jeet Carter. This is Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Wax, 10th Group. We have a situation. Are you available to speak tonight? She looked at the message for a long moment. Darnell Wax. She knew that name. She'd worked alongside him once, briefly, on a medical support operation she wasn't going to think too hard about in a kitchen in Oregon. He wouldn't have her current personal number unless someone had looked for it specifically. She typed back, "How did you get this number?" His response took 30 seconds. "Your mother gave it to your sister mentioned it to someone. It took 3 calls to get here." I apologize for the hour. It's important. She set the phone face down on the table, picked it up, set it down again. Gray jumped onto the table and walked across her arms in the specific way cats had of pretending they weren't asking for something while absolutely asking for something. She scratched behind his ear automatically. She picked the phone back up and called the number. It rang once. MSG and Carter, Wax said. Thank you for calling back. I'll be brief because we're moving fast on this end. There's a situation in Montgomery County that involves a federal investigation, and your name has come up in the context of a separate complaint filed today against an officer of the Montgomery PD. A pause. We're already in the area. We'd like to speak with you in person, tonight, if possible. Emily looked at the recording app still open on her screen. Tonight's fine, she said. He answered on the first ring, and that alone told her something. MSG and Carter, Wax said. Thank you for calling back. I'll be brief because we're moving fast on this end. There's a situation in Montgomery County that involves a federal investigation, and your name has come up in the context of a separate complaint filed today against an officer of the Montgomery PD. A pause. We're already in the area. We'd like to speak with you in person, tonight, if possible. She looked at the recording app still open on her screen. Tonight's fine, she said. They agreed on a location, a diner on Route 12 that she knew was open until 2, the kind of place that didn't ask questions about why people were meeting at 1 in the morning. She changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a gray pullover, topped off Gray's water bowl, and was back in the car in under 8 minutes. The diner was called Marta's, and it had the specific amber warmth of places that had been feeding people since before the interstate rerouted traffic away from them and left them surviving on regulars and late-night stragglers. She got there first. She took a booth in the back with sight lines to both doors, a habit so old she didn't consciously register it anymore. Wax arrived 6 minutes later with a woman she didn't know. Late 30s, civilian clothes that sat on her, the way civilian clothes always sat on people who normally wore uniforms, which was slightly wrong in the shoulders. Wax himself had put on weight since she'd last seen him, or maybe he'd just redistributed it. He was 50-something with close-cropped gray hair and the permanent squint of a man who'd spent too many years in bright sun. He slid into the booth across from her. The woman took the seat beside him. You look tired, Wax said. I just finished a double. Right, sorry. He set a folder on the table but didn't open it. This is Agent Lena Ferris. She's with the DOJ, Civil Rights Division. Emily looked at Ferris. Civil rights. We've been building a case in Montgomery County for about 4 months, Ferris said. Her voice was direct without being hard. Specifically around a pattern of excessive force and illegal detention practices connected to certain officers in the East Precinct. Your name came up today, twice, actually, from 2 separate individuals who interacted with Officer Holloway. Emily didn't say anything. The construction worker from 3 weeks ago, Ferris continued. His name is Marcus Webb. He filed a complaint with our office after receiving a referral from someone at the hospital. Emily remembered the card she'd written her number on. She hadn't heard from Webb directly, but apparently the card had moved through other hands. And the second one? A minor, 17 years old. A school counselor connected her to our office last week. Ferris paused. She mentioned a nurse who sat with her. The diner hummed around them. A truck driver 2 tables over was eating eggs and reading something on his phone. The cook was running something through the fryer. We're not asking you to be a witness in our existing case, Wax said. Not yet. What we're asking is whether you'd be willing to document your own experiences with Holloway and provide a formal statement, specifically anything from tonight. Emily had the audio file already backed up to 3 separate locations, but she didn't mention that immediately. What's the federal angle? Pattern and practice, Ferris said. Individual misconduct is a local issue. When you can demonstrate systemic, documented abuse targeting specific populations, and we can, it becomes a federal civil rights violation. We're close. We need the pattern locked down before we move. How many complaints are in your file already? Ferris and Wax exchanged a look that was brief and communicated something Emily couldn't quite read. 11 documented, Ferris said. Probably twice that unreported. Emily sat with that number for a moment. 11. She thought about the teenage girl keeping her eyes on her own hands. She thought about the way Marcus Webb's shoulder had sat wrong in the socket, the imaging report she'd printed and kept in her own files because she didn't trust the hospitals. I have audio from tonight, she said. Both of them went still. She told them what had happened: the stop, the false pretense, the unlawful search attempt, the exact words Holloway had used. She described the recording, the timestamp, the cloud backup. She described the prior incidents in clinical terms, the way she'd been trained to describe things. Objective, sequenced, free of interpretive language. She watched Ferris take notes in a small notebook with the kind of handwriting that was fast and illegible in the way that meant she'd been writing notes for a long time. When Emily finished, Wax leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a second. He pulled you over on the same night you filed the imaging report. 2 hours after. He's not subtle, Ferris said, not approvingly. He's never needed to be, Emily said. That's the whole problem. She handed over the audio file via a secure transfer link Ferris set up on a department-issued device. Ferris confirmed receipt and locked it immediately. The whole process took 4 minutes. What came next was the part Emily hadn't anticipated. Wax said, "There's something else we need to tell you." He finally opened the folder. He turned it around and slid it across the table. It was a photograph. Surveillance quality, slightly grainy, showing a man outside what looked like a municipal building. She didn't recognize him. "His name is Philip Garrett," Wax said. "He's a county commissioner. He's also, as of 6 weeks ago, the target of a separate federal investigation into bid rigging and extortion connected to county construction contracts." She looked up. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because Holloway isn't just an officer who makes bad decisions. He's been running interference for Garrett for at least 2 years. We think some of the detentions, the people he brings into your ER for clearance, are connected to Garrett's operations. People who've gotten too close to the contracting irregularities. People who need to be scared off or discredited." Emily thought of the man with the shaking hands. Not nervous shaking, scared shaking. "Marcus Webb," she said slowly. "What does he do?" "Civil engineer," Ferris said. "He was a subcontractor on 2 of the projects under investigation." The pieces didn't snap into place with any kind of drama. They assembled themselves quietly, the way things did when you'd been looking at part of a picture for long enough that the rest of it started to make a particular kind of sense. She set the photograph down on the folder. "So tonight," she said, "when Holloway pulled me over, you made it harder for him to deliver Webb cleanly," Ferris said. "You documented the injury. You ordered the imaging. You created a record he can't make disappear. He needed to communicate to you that doing that has a cost." "He underestimated the cost of communicating it," Emily said. Wax almost smiled. "Yeah, he did." She drove home at 2:15 with a lot more in her head than she'd left the house with. She slept for 4 hours, woke before the alarm, lay in the dark for 10 minutes running through what she knew and what she still didn't, then got up and made coffee. She was due back at Haven Brook for a 7 a.m. shift. She went. The next 4 days operated in 2 registers simultaneously. On the surface, trauma nursing, patient charts, the ordinary machinery of an ER that never fully stopped. Below the surface, a careful, quiet gathering of everything she'd been documenting for 8 months, organized now with a different kind of purpose. She'd been keeping notes out of professional habit and low-level unease. She began organizing them as evidence. She was meticulous about it. She had dates, times, patient names where she had legal access to them, descriptions of incidents, cross-references to imaging reports. She had her own words, written the same night the events had occurred, which meant they were contemporaneous, legally significant in a way that notes written in retrospect were not. Wax had emphasized that twice. She also kept doing her job because she was still a nurse and there were still patients, and because letting her work slip would accomplish nothing except giving Price something to point at. Price, she noticed, had been cooler since the night of the confrontation with Holloway. Not hostile, cooler. Like a man who had done a calculation and arrived at a number he was still deciding what to do with. He didn't address her directly about what had happened. He also stopped sending patients her way for anything that touched on law enforcement involvement, which was a small, pointed message that she received and filed away. Brenda Calloway was a different situation. On the day, Brenda found her in the supply corridor and said very quietly, "Webb's attorney called the hospital." Emily kept her face neutral. "I heard there might be an inquiry. Garrison is nervous." "About what?" Brenda looked at her steadily. "You know what? The imaging report, the documentation. There's talk that someone's been building a case, and when people start looking at the ER's role in some of these clearances, The ER's role has been to provide accurate medical care, Emily said. If that documentation is inconvenient for someone, that's not a nursing problem. Brenda was quiet for a moment. Be careful, Emily. I'm being careful. No, Brenda said, and there was something tired and specific in her voice. You're being right. That's not the same thing. Emily thought about that for the rest of the shift. On the fifth day, Price called her into his office at the end of her rotation. The office was small and had too much stuff in it. Stacked journals, an ergonomic chair that looked like it had never been adjusted from the factory setting, a framed photograph on the desk of Price, at some kind of medical conference, shaking hands with someone who looked pleased to be photographed. He sat behind his desk, and she sat in the chair across from it, and she gave herself 1 second to note that the configuration was designed to communicate something about relative positions. I'm going to be direct with you, Price said. Please. I've received a complaint from Officer Holloway's precinct regarding your conduct during the web clearance. The complaint alleges you exceeded your scope of nursing practice and deliberately obstructed a law enforcement officer in the performance of his duties. She kept her expression still. That complaint isn't accurate. Whether or not it's accurate, the hospital's position is that we need to review your documentation practices going forward, specifically any imaging orders or additional interventions connected to law enforcement patients. You're asking me to narrow my clinical assessment for patients brought in by law enforcement. I'm asking you to be more careful about when you escalate. Escalating is what saved Marcus Webb's shoulder, she said. The injury was real. The imaging confirmed it. That's not scope creep, Dr. Price. That's basic nursing assessment. Emily, is this a formal performance review? A pause. Not at this point. Then I'd like the complaint in writing, with the specific claims documented, so that I can respond formally. That's my right under the hospital's personnel policy. Price looked at her like she'd produced a chess piece he hadn't known was on the board. I'll have HR contact you. Thank you. She stood. Is there anything else? There wasn't. She walked out through the ER, past the station where Brenda was charting and didn't look up, past Bay 3, where a new admit was being triaged, through the ambulance bay doors and into the parking lot, where the evening was coming down gray and cool and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. She sat in her car and texted Ferris. Formal complaint filed with the hospital by Holloway's precinct. Request for documentation in writing submitted. Alert level? Ferris responded in 90 seconds. Expected. Don't engage further at the hospital without legal counsel present. We're moving on the county side faster than anticipated. Stand by. She stared at that last phrase. Stand by. It was so specifically military in its construction that she almost laughed. She drove home. She fed Gray. She sat at the kitchen table and did not open her laptop because there was nothing more to add to her documentation tonight, and working herself into a spiral was not useful. She ate leftover rice from the fridge, directly from the container, standing at the counter, which was not something she'd be proud of in the morning, but was what was available right now. She was washing the container when her phone rang. Wax. We have a problem, he said. She turned the water off. Tell me. Marcus Webb was picked up again tonight. Different officer, but the call came from Holloway's precinct. They're holding him on a misdemeanor obstruction charge that's so thin it'll dissolve in 24 hours. But by then, whatever he's been cooperating with us on could be compromised if they get access to his phone. Can you intervene? Webb's attorney is already filing, but here's the thing, Emily. They didn't just pick up Webb. A pause, the kind that had weight. They picked up his daughter too. She's 17. She's the girl from your ER. Emily put her hand flat on the counter. The surface was cool and slightly damp from the sink. They're holding her for curfew violation, Wax continued, which in this county, for a minor, means she gets processed through Havenbrook for medical clearance before she can be released to a guardian. The room felt very specific around her suddenly. The angle of the light, the sound of the refrigerator, Gray sitting on the windowsill watching her with the particular attention cats paid to tension they could sense but not name. They're going to bring her to my ER, Emily said, or whoever's on shift. I'm on shift tomorrow at 7. I know. Wax, is she okay? As far as we know, she wasn't hurt. But she's scared and she doesn't know where her father is. And whoever processes her tonight is going to be in a position to either make this a lot worse or... I'll be there, Emily said. Emily, I need you to understand. If Holloway is connected to what happens tomorrow night, you're going to be in the room with someone who already filed a complaint against you, who already pulled you over on a dark road. This isn't the same as documenting a shoulder injury. I know what it is. I just want to make sure, Darnell. She almost never used his first name. I've been in rooms with worse than Derek Holloway. I know how to be in a room. A long pause. I know you do, he said finally, and in his voice was the specific quality of someone who meant it. She hung up. She stood at the counter for another moment. Then she went to her room, set 2 alarms for 5:30, and got into bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark, running through what tomorrow would require, the same way she used to run through what a mission would require. Not worrying, not rehearsing catastrophes, just mapping. Sequence. Response. What she controlled and what she didn't. What she would do if the situation went a direction she hadn't anticipated. She was still mapping when sleep finally came for her, and when the first alarm went off at 5:30, she was already partially awake, lying in the dark with gray curled against the back of her knees and the rain finally arriving against the window. She showered, dressed, ate half a piece of toast because her stomach didn't want more than that. She drove to Havenbrook in the rain with her hands steady on the wheel and the early morning city still mostly dark around her. She checked in, changed into scrubs, and took the first chart of the day. By 9 a.m., the ER had found its rhythm, and Emily was in it. 2 post-surgical follow-ups, 1 pediatric fever case, 1 chest pain that turned into a panic attack once the ECG came back clean. She moved through it the way she always moved through work, steadily, without hurry that wasn't necessary, with the specific attention she gave to everyone who ended up on the other side of the curtain from her. Brenda came on at 10. She caught Emily's eye from across the station and gave her a look that communicated something Emily couldn't quite decode, which was unusual because Brenda was generally very readable. At 10:40, the ambulance bay doors opened. Not an ambulance, a cruiser. 2 of them, actually, which was one more than clearance procedures required. The officer who came in first was someone she didn't recognize. Mid-30s, dark jacket, the body language of someone executing a task he'd been given and was not personally invested in. Behind him was a second officer. And behind the second officer, in civilian clothes, with her arms crossed tight over her chest and her jaw set in the particular way of someone trying very hard not to cry in front of people she didn't trust. The girl from the panic attack. The girl who had kept her eyes on her own hands. She was 17, and she was scared, and she was here. Emily picked up the intake chart and walked toward the bay. She was halfway there when the ambulance bay doors opened a second time, and the man who walked through them was Derek Holloway. He wasn't in uniform. He was in a jacket and dark pants, civilian but with his badge clipped to his belt the way some officers wore it off-duty, making sure the room registered what he was. He surveyed the ER floor once, the kind of practice scan that took in everything without appearing to look at anything, and then his eyes found Emily. He didn't move toward her. He didn't need to. The look was enough, and what it said was, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and so do you, and neither of us can stop this right now." Emily held the intake chart in her hand and looked back at him. She thought of Gray on the windowsill. She thought of Wax saying, "I know you do." She thought of Marcus Webb's hand shaking on his knee, and the way his daughter had said, "He told me not to talk to anyone at the hospital." She walked to the bay. She introduced herself to the girl. Her name was Dara, and she kept her voice at the specific register she'd learned worked. Steady, not falsely warm, not clinical, just human. She noticed the way Dara's shoulders came down a half-inch from her ears when Emily said, "I'm going to need the officers to step out while I do the assessment. That's standard procedure." It wasn't always standard procedure, but it was in the documentation if anyone wanted to check. The first officer stepped back without argument. Holloway didn't move. "Sir," Emily said, without looking at him directly, "I need the room for the patient assessment. I'm the supervising officer on this intake." "That's noted. I still need the room." The pause lasted 4 seconds. Emily counted them. Then Holloway stepped back, just outside the curtain line, and she heard the quality of his breath, controlled, tight, and she knew that behind the curtain he was standing close enough to hear everything. She didn't care. She was going to say what she would say regardless. She turned to Dara, and Dara was looking at her with an expression that was still guarded and still scared and also something else underneath. Something that wanted to be trust, or at least was considering the possibility. "You're not in trouble," Emily said quietly. "Not with me." and I'm going to ask you some questions, and you only have to answer what you want to answer, okay? Dara looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Emily picked up her pen, and outside the curtain, someone's radio crackled, and then went abruptly, completely silent. And then she heard it. From somewhere beyond the ambulance bay, muffled by distance and walls but unmistakable. The low particular sound of vehicles that moved with a different kind of weight than civilian traffic. More than one. Coming to a stop. Dara heard it too. She looked toward the bay doors with wide eyes. Emily kept her expression calm, but her hand, just briefly, tightened on the pen. The sound came again. Closer now, unmistakably mechanical, the specific idle of heavy vehicles that had cut their sirens but not their engines. Dara's eyes were fixed on the bay doors. Emily kept hers on Dara. "Hey," Emily said quietly. "Look at me." Dara pulled her gaze back. Her jaw was still set, but her eyes had gone glassy at the edges. The kind of glassy that was one wrong word away from breaking. "Whatever's happening out there is not your problem right now," Emily said. "Right now you're my patient, and that means this curtain is the only wall that matters. Understand?" A beat. Then Dara nodded, small and jerky. Emily kept her voice at the same register and finished the assessment. Vitals, visual check, a few direct questions delivered without pressure, noting answers that Dara gave in the clipped, careful way of someone who had learned that talking to authority figures had costs attached. No physical injuries, elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure for her age, both consistent with acute stress. Emily documented all of it. She was thorough because she was always thorough, and also because she understood that what she was writing right now was going to matter in ways that had nothing to do with tonight's discharge. Outside the curtain, the ER had changed register. She could hear it without being able to see it. Voices dropping in volume, the particular quality of a room that was recalibrating around something unexpected. Footsteps that didn't have the soft-souled sound of nursing staff. She heard Holloway say something she couldn't make out. Then a voice she didn't recognize responded, and whatever it said made Holloway stop talking. Emily finished the final notation, capped her pen, and looked at Dara. "Is there an adult you want me to call? Family, neighbor, anyone?" "My dad," Dara said. Her voice was controlled until she said the word, and then it wasn't. "Where is he?" "Nobody will tell me where he is." "I'm going to find out," Emily said. She meant it without caveats, which was maybe not strictly appropriate for a nursing context, but she'd stopped being strictly appropriate about 48 hours ago and wasn't planning to reverse course now. "You stay here. You don't have to talk to anyone until I'm back. If someone tries to move you, you tell them you're still under medical assessment. Those are your rights." Dara looked at her with the expression of someone who wasn't sure rights were real things in her experience, but was considering the possibility that they might be real in this room. "Okay," she said. Emily stepped through the curtain. The ER had not transformed. It was still an ER, still fluorescent and overworked and smelling of antiseptic. But the quality of movement in it had changed. The nurses at the central station were doing the thing where they worked while tracking peripheral motion. Price had materialized from somewhere and was standing near the back hallway with his arms folded, his face showing the expression of a man watching a situation arrive that he had not prepared adequately for. Near the ambulance bay doors, two men in civilian clothes stood with the unmistakable bearing of military intelligence or federal law enforcement, which was to say they held very still, tracked everything, and said nothing. One of them Emily recognized from somewhere distant, and she couldn't immediately place it. The other she didn't know at all. Holloway was standing 12 feet from the bay doors. He was still and his jaw was tight, and there was something in his posture that she hadn't seen on him before, which was uncertainty. Not expressed, not visible on the surface, but it was in the slight overwork of his stillness, the way a man went rigid when he was working to prevent himself from reacting. A third figure came through the ambulance bay doors. He was tall, early 50s, in civilian clothes that were better quality than the others. Dark jacket, collared shirt, the haircut of someone who'd been in uniform for decades and hadn't quite given it up in civilian life. He moved through the ER with the particular attention of a person reading a room on entry, cataloging it, and he did this without slowing his pace or appearing to look at anything specifically. He came straight to Emily. "Master Sergeant Carter," he said. Not loud, conversational volume, but crisp at the edges. She felt the room absorb it. She felt peripherally Holloway absorb it. I go by Emily now, she said. Fair enough. He extended his hand. Colonel Marcus Briggs, Army Criminal Investigation Division. We spoke with Lieutenant Colonel Wax. I understand you've been having an interesting week. That's a word for it. Briggs glanced past her at the closed curtain, then back. Patient? Still under assessment. We're going to need a few minutes with you when you're clear. We also need to establish who has jurisdiction over the individuals currently in this facility connected to the Garrett matter. There's some overlap with the DOJ case and we're working through it, but right now, he stopped and something shifted in his expression just slightly. Is that Officer Holloway? Emily didn't turn around. Yes. Briggs looked at Holloway for 3 seconds with the particular quality of a man who was confirming something he already knew. Then he looked back at Emily. Finish your assessment. We'll be here. She went back through the curtain. Dara had pulled her knees up to her chest on the exam table, making herself smaller without seeming to realize she was doing it. Emily sat in the chair beside the table rather than standing, which changed the geometry. Your father is in county holding, Emily said. That's what I know right now. His attorney is already involved. He's not alone. Dara's breath came out of her in a way that sounded like it had been held for hours. Is he going to be okay? I think so. I can't promise that, but I think so. It wasn't a comfortable answer. It was an honest one, and Dara seemed to register the difference because some of the remaining guardedness left her face. Not all of it, just some. The officer outside, Dara said. Holloway. He was there when they picked up my dad. I know. He looked at me the same way he looked at me in here before, like he was checking to see if I was scared. Emily held that for a moment. Were you? Yeah. A pause. I'm still scared. That's okay, Emily said. Being scared doesn't mean you're wrong to be here, and it doesn't mean nothing's going to happen. She picked up her pen and added a final note to the chart. Medically, you're clear. But I'm not signing off on this discharge until there's a responsible adult here to receive you, and I'm documenting that as clinical protocol, which means you're here with me for a while longer. Dara looked at her. You're stalling. I'm following protocol, Emily said, and let the silence carry the rest. She came back out to find the ER had reorganized itself around 2 separate centers of gravity. Briggs and his team had established a quiet presence near the administrative corridor. Not intrusive, but immovable, the way a piece of furniture that's always been there is immovable. Holloway remained near the bay doors. The gap between them was not accidental. Ferris arrived 6 minutes later, which meant she'd been close, probably already in the building or the parking structure. She came in through the main entrance in a dark blazer, badge visible on her belt, and made brief eye contact with Emily before heading to Briggs. Price detached himself from the back hallway and came toward the central station. He caught Emily's eye and gestured toward his office. She shook her head. Not now. His expression did something complicated, and he stopped gesturing. What happened next unfolded over 17 minutes, and Emily was in the middle of it in the specific way of someone who has prepared for a situation and then finds the situation is slightly different than they prepared for, which was always how it was. Holloway's moment came when Ferris approached him. It wasn't dramatic. Ferris was constitutionally undramatic, which was probably why she was effective. She stood in front of him and said something in a low voice, and Emily was close enough to see his face but not to hear the words. Whatever Ferris said, Holloway's jaw moved once, like he was working to keep something from coming out, and then he said something back, and Ferris showed him something on the phone she was holding, and whatever it was put a specific quality into Holloway's face that Emily had not seen there before. He knew, she realized. He'd just been told something that confirmed what he'd been afraid of, and the quality of his stillness had changed from controlled to something closer to contained damage. Then Briggs was standing beside Ferris, and Briggs said something that Emily also couldn't hear, and Holloway said louder, I'm entitled to... Of course, Briggs said, audible now and completely even. We'll go through it all. Let's step outside. Holloway looked at Emily once. The look lasted 2 seconds, and it contained a specific kind of anger. Not the confident, proprietary anger of someone enforcing a hierarchy, but the raw, disorganized anger of someone watching the hierarchy stop working. Then he went through the doors with Briggs and 2 others, and the ER absorbed his absence the way rooms do when a particular pressure is removed. Not relaxed exactly, just differently configured. Emily exhaled. She hadn't been aware she was holding anything, but apparently she was. Brenda appeared at her elbow. Are you going to explain any of that? Probably not right now. Right. Brenda looked at the bay doors. Is he coming back in? I don't think so. Emily picked up Dara's chart. Can you find out if Marcus Webb's attorney has filed the release paperwork? The daughter's in Bay 4 and I need an adult to collect her. Brenda looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had just revised their understanding of a situation significantly and was processing the revision. I'll call the desk. She did. 40 minutes later, a woman arrived. Webb's sister, Dara's aunt, a compact woman in her 40s with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been managing a crisis for hours and hadn't stopped moving. She came through the main entrance asking for Emily by name, and when Emily met her in the hall, the woman grabbed her hand with both of hers and held it for 1 second without saying anything, which said everything. Dara left with her aunt. On her way past Emily, she stopped. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Emily said. This isn't done. I know. A pause. But still. Emily watched them go through the sliding doors and out into the gray late morning air. Then she turned back to the station and found Ferris waiting for her. We need you in the conference room, Ferris said. Now, if you can. The hospital's administrative conference room was on the second floor and smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. Briggs was there. Wax was there, which surprised her. She hadn't seen him arrive. There were 2 other people she didn't know, one in military dress uniform and one in a dark suit, and they were sitting at different ends of the table, which communicated something about the jurisdictional situation. She sat. Ferris sat across from her. Briggs stood near the window. We'll be brief, Briggs said. The situation has moved faster than we anticipated in the last 72 hours. Holloway has been placed on administrative suspension pending investigation. That's effective as of this morning. The precinct commander agreed without resistance, which tells us something about how much internal goodwill Holloway had left. What about Garrett? Emily asked. Wax answered. The county commissioner angle is DOJ. It's moving. What I can tell you is that the arrests connected to the construction contract investigation are expected within the week. He paused. Your documentation, specifically the imaging records, the contemporaneous notes, and the audio from the traffic stop, constitutes a significant portion of the evidentiary pattern. The DOJ considers you a material witness. The man in the suit, who had not been introduced, said, We'd like to discuss your formal cooperation and the protections that accompany that designation. I'm already cooperating, Emily said, more formally than you have been. He had the speech pattern of a lawyer, precise, sequenced, stripped of personality. There are considerations to address. Your employment situation at Havenbrook, for one. The complaint Holloway filed against you creates a paper record that could be used. The complaint was retaliatory, Emily said. I have documentation of the clinical basis for every decision it references. If the hospital acts on that complaint after the investigation becomes public, that's a separate legal exposure for Havenbrook. The lawyer paused. Then he said, with what might have been slight approval in a very controlled face, Yes, it is. Briggs stepped away from the window. There's something else, and this is the part that takes us beyond the county matter. He looked at her directly. We've been conducting a parallel review in connection with the DoD whistleblower matter. Separate jurisdiction, separate timeline, but connected to some of the same county infrastructure. During that review, your name came up in a context that has nothing to do with Holloway. He pulled out a folder, not the same one as before, and set it on the table. There's a gap in the attribution on a medical rescue operation that occurred 8 years ago. The operation involved a joint special operations unit. 2 soldiers who should not have survived their injuries did. The medical officer on record was KIA before he could be properly documented. The unit commander filed an after-action report noting that a combat medic, rank not recorded, made the call that saved them. He opened the folder. The surviving soldiers have been trying to locate that medic for 6 years. Emily looked at the folder. She didn't touch it. She knew what was in it. She'd known what was in it from the moment he said 8 years ago, and joint special operations and 2 soldiers who should not have survived. That's not relevant to what's happening here, she said. It might be, Wax said quietly. Emily. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same expression she'd seen in the diner. Careful, specific, the face of someone who had information and was working out how hard to push. "The unit commander," she said. "His name?" Briggs said the name. She was quiet for a moment. She'd worked with that unit for 11 weeks. She'd never thought she'd hear that name in a conference room in Montgomery, Oregon, connected to a corrupt county commissioner and a cop who'd pulled her over on a dark road. "Why does it matter now?" she asked. "Because the two soldiers he's been trying to locate the medic for are both in positions where this citation would close a 7-year administrative gap," Briggs said. "And because the unit commander is currently involved in an advisory capacity on the DoD's oversight of the county infrastructure investigation. He asked us to look." The room held very still. Outside, somewhere in the building, an intercom called a code. She registered it automatically. Room 318, cardiac event. She was nowhere near equipped to respond from a conference room on the second floor, and tracked the sound of running feet below. She looked at the folder on the table. "I need to know," she said finally, "what you're asking me to say." "Nothing you haven't already done," Briggs said. "We're asking you to let the record say you were there." She put her hand flat on the table. The surface was cool and slightly textured under her palm. She thought about the two soldiers. She could see them. She could see the specific, terrible quality of that night. The decisions made in increments of seconds. The things she'd had to do with equipment that wasn't sufficient for what she was doing. She'd gotten them out. She'd gotten them out, and then she'd gone back to her assigned station, and she'd written in her own notes: field medical intervention, 2 casualties stabilized, transport arranged. She hadn't put her name on it. She had her reasons, and the reasons were hers. But those soldiers were alive. She pulled the folder toward her and opened it. The first page was an after-action summary. The second was a medical report with a gap where the treating medic's information should have been. The third page made her stop. It was a photograph, taken by someone with a phone or a field camera, grainy, the timestamp showing the date and a location designation she recognized. It showed the inside of a transport vehicle, 2 men on stretchers, and a woman in a blood-soaked uniform kneeling between them with both hands occupied and her face turned slightly away from the camera, concentrating on something that was not the camera. She'd never known that photo existed. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed the folder. "All right," she said. What came after that was procedural. Forms, formal witness designation paperwork, a brief recorded statement that Ferris managed with the same undramatic competence she brought to everything. Emily answered what she was asked. She was precise. She didn't add anything that wasn't asked for. By the time she came back downstairs, the shift had changed. The afternoon crew was coming on, and the morning staff was cycling out. She collected her things from the locker room and sat on the bench for a moment in the specific exhaustion that came not from lack of sleep but from spending several hours in rooms where every word had weight. She thought about Dara going out through the sliding doors with her aunt. She thought about Marcus Webb in County Holding, and whether his attorney had gotten him out yet, and whether the partial rotator cuff tear was being treated, or whether it was sitting in someone's notes being ignored. She thought about a transport vehicle in the dark, 8 years ago, and 2 men who shouldn't have made it and did. She tied her shoes. She picked up her bag. Her phone was buzzing when she got to the parking lot. Not Wax, not Ferris. A number she didn't recognize, local area code. She almost didn't answer it. She almost put it in her bag and drove home. She answered it. The voice on the other end was male, older, slightly ragged at the edges, in the way of someone who was working to keep their composure and mostly succeeding. "Is this Emily Carter, the nurse at Havenbrook?" "Who's asking?" "My name is Terrence Webb. Marcus is my brother." A pause. "They let him out an hour ago. The attorney got the charge dismissed. They didn't even fight it. He's home." She sat down on the hood of her car. "Good, that's good. He wanted me to call you. He said to tell you he didn't know if you'd remember him, but that he'd been trying to figure out how to say thank you since the first night." Another pause. "His shoulder is bad. The doctors say surgery maybe, but he's home." She looked at the parking lot. The gray afternoon light was doing something ordinary and complicated to the puddles from the morning's rain. "Tell him to follow up with the orthopedic referral. The injury is documented. The insurance claim will be straightforward." "Okay." A beat. "The kid too? Dara?" She said, "Dara's okay," Emily said. She was brave. Terrence Webb made a sound that was mostly exhale. "Thank you," he said. "I know that might not—" "It covers it," Emily said. She hung up. She sat on the hood of the car for another minute, which was not comfortable but which she needed. Then she got in and drove home, and the rain had stopped, and the river road was clear, and she drove the whole way without checking her mirrors once. She got home. She fed Gray. She stood at the kitchen window and drank a glass of water and watched the light change over the neighbor's roof. Her phone buzzed again. Ferris this time. One thing you should know before tomorrow. Holloway's body camera footage from the traffic stop has been pulled by Internal Affairs. It was flagged this afternoon. Emily wrote back. And? The response came after 30 seconds. He turned it off before he got out of the cruiser. There's 14 seconds of footage and then nothing. She read that twice. Which means, she typed back, the only record of that stop is mine. Ferris responded immediately, yes, which is why what you captured matters as much as it does. Sleep, Emily. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. She put the phone on the counter. She looked at it. Gray jumped up beside it and walked across her forearm in his specific, unhelpful way. She scratched behind his ear and went to sit at the kitchen table. The audio file. 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Holloway's voice on it, steady and contained and very specific in what it said. You're just a nurse. Stay in your place. The sound of gravel under her shoes. The particular flatness he'd put into the word powerless. She'd uploaded it to 3 locations. She'd sent a copy to Ferris that first night. It was in more hands now than she could count, time-stamped and chain of custody documented in ways that a 14-second body camera clip followed by nothing was going to have a very hard time contesting. She opened her laptop. Not to add anything. Ferris was right. There was nothing left to add tonight. She opened it because there was one email she needed to write that was not connected to the investigation, not connected to Holloway, or Garrett, or Havenbrook's administrative machinery. She wrote to the unit commander whose name Briggs had said in the conference room. She wrote 4 sentences. She said she'd received the information about the after-action review. She said she understood what was being asked. She said she would cooperate with whatever formal process the documentation required. And she said she was glad the 2 men were alive, which was true, and which she had never said out loud to anyone. She hit send before she could revise it into something more formal and less honest. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed, and this time she was asleep within 10 minutes, which was the sleep of someone who had run out of things they could do tonight and had, for once, actually stopped trying. She did not dream, or if she did, she didn't remember it. At 4:52 a.m., her phone lit up the dark bedroom with a text from Wax. Don't go in through the main entrance tomorrow. Come through the ambulance bay and bring your documentation. All of it. Hard copies. She read it once. She typed back, why? His response took 40 seconds. Because Garrison Price filed paperwork at midnight suspending your nursing privileges pending review. And because when you walk in tomorrow morning, there are going to be people waiting who have questions about why a trauma nurse at a county hospital had a recorded conversation with federal investigators in the administrative conference room. She sat up in bed. Gray lifted his head from the foot of the mattress. And, she typed. And Wax wrote, one of those people is going to be from the state medical board. Holloway's attorney filed a complaint 2 hours ago claiming your clinical documentation was fabricated to support a federal narrative rather than a patient care standard. She looked at that sentence for a long time. The imaging report, she wrote. The rotator cuff finding. That came from a board-certified radiologist. I know, Wax responded. But they're not going after the imaging. They're going after you. They're claiming you altered the timestamps on your clinical notes to make them appear contemporaneous when they weren't. The bedroom was very quiet. The clock on her phone read 4:53 a.m. That's not true, she wrote. I know, Wax said again, but they have someone at the hospital who is going to testify that it is. She stared at the screen. The someone. She ran through the roster in her head, the people who had access to her documentation, who had seen her notes, who had been in proximity to her work over the past 8 months. The list was not long. The list had a name at the top of it that she did not want to put there. Who? She typed. The response came, and she read it, and for the first time in 2 days, something moved through her that wasn't calculation or clarity or measured response, something that was older and rawer than any of that. Not panic, but close to it. The feeling of ground that seemed solid shifting under her feet in a way she had not anticipated and had not prepared for. She read the name again. Then she got out of bed and started getting dressed, because sleep was no longer available and morning was coming whether she was ready for it or not. The name on the screen was Brenda Calloway. Emily stood in the dark bedroom holding her phone and read it twice because the first time didn't fully land. Brenda, 61 years old, 19 years at Havenbrook, the woman who had said, "Let it go and be careful, and being right isn't the same as being careful." The woman Emily had, without quite deciding to, trusted more than anyone else in that building. She set the phone on the dresser. She picked up her jeans from the chair. She put them on. The thing about betrayal in her experience was that it didn't arrive as a dramatic collapse. It arrived as a recalibration, a quiet, unpleasant process of going back through everything you thought you understood and adjusting for new information. She'd done it before. In other contexts, with higher physical stakes. The emotional texture was the same regardless. She thought about the moments Brenda had been positioned to access her documentation. The nursing station. The shared charting system. The supply corridor conversation where Brenda had mentioned Webb's attorney. Not as a warning, Emily now understood, but as a probe. Checking what Emily knew, checking how far it had gotten. She pulled on her shirt. She texted Wax. "Who does Brenda Calloway report to outside the hospital?" His response came in under 2 minutes. "We're working on that." One possibility. Her husband is a retired county employee, worked in the procurement office under Garrett's predecessor. "We don't have the connection confirmed yet." Emily wrote back, "Confirm it before morning." She didn't sleep again. She made coffee at 5:15 and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, going through her own documentation with the specific cold attention of someone looking for vulnerabilities rather than strengths. If someone was claiming the timestamps were altered, she needed to understand exactly what they were pointing at and why the claim didn't hold. The timestamps were fine. She knew they were fine because she'd used the hospital's own charting system for everything, which auto-generated timestamps she couldn't alter even if she'd wanted to. The contemporaneous personal notes she'd kept outside the system were in a separate app on her phone that logged edits with version history. She had receipts on every word. The problem wasn't the evidence. The problem was that a process had been initiated, a state medical board complaint alongside a hospital suspension, and process had its own momentum regardless of what the evidence said. She'd seen people with clean records get buried under process, while the truth sat in a folder somewhere waiting for someone to have time to look at it. She was not going to let that happen, but she needed to be precise about the sequence. At 6 a.m., she called a number she'd been given by Ferris 3 days ago and hadn't used yet. It rang 4 times, and then a woman answered, awake and alert, in the way of someone who was used to calls at hours that were inconvenient. "This is Reyes. My name is Emily Carter. Agent Ferris gave me this number. I need to speak with an attorney about a medical board complaint filed in the last 2 hours. A brief pause. "I'm aware of your case. Give me 45 minutes and meet me at the hospital, not the main entrance." "Ambulance bay," Emily said. "Yes." She arrived at Havenbrook at 6:50 through the ambulance bay, which was quieter at this hour than the main entrance. The night shift wrapping its last cases. The morning crew not yet fully operational. She knew the rhythm of this building in a way she hadn't fully appreciated until she was navigating it deliberately. The attorney, Sandra Reyes, according to the card she pressed into Emily's hand in the bay corridor, was 40, compact, with the particular energy of someone who moved faster than the situations they were managing, which was the only kind of attorney useful in circumstances like these. She'd already pulled the complaint on her phone and was reading it as she walked. "Walk me through your documentation practices," Reyes said, not looking up from the screen. Emily did. All of it in sequence, from the first notation about the construction worker 6 weeks ago through to the audio recording and the cloud backup and the chain of custody on every piece of paper that had touched the Webb case. Reyes listened without interrupting, which Emily appreciated. When she finished, Reyes said, "The timestamp claim is garbage. It'll take us one morning to demonstrate that with the system logs. That's not the real problem." "What's the real problem?" "The real problem is that the suspension is real, and while it's in effect, you cannot practice in this facility, which means you cannot be present as a clinician, which means your access to certain documentation channels is restricted. They're trying to cut you off from your own evidentiary record." Emily understood that immediately. Price filed at midnight. Exactly. Before the federal investigators could establish a protective order over your documentation. Whoever advised that move knew what they were doing. Reyes finally looked up from her phone. Holloway's attorney. His name is Vincent Carr. He's done this before. Targeted the professional licenses of witnesses in cases where the physical evidence was strong. Destabilize the person, create questions about their credibility, slow the proceedings. It usually works because most people can't sustain a months-long fight against a concurrent professional review while also serving as a federal witness. I'm not most people, Emily said. No, Reyes said, looking at her with the specific assessment of someone who was deciding how much to rely on a client's self-evaluation. You're not, but you still need to be careful about what you do in the next 4 hours, because anything that looks like you're circumventing the suspension rather than responding to it through proper channels gives Carr something to work with. They moved through the corridor to a small conference room near the nursing administration office, not the second-floor room from yesterday, a smaller one, the kind used for scheduling conflicts and HR conversations. Reyes set up her laptop. Emily put her phone on the table between them and pulled up the documentation chain. What followed was 2 hours of work that was unglamorous and necessary, and felt, to Emily, like the closest thing to reasserting control she'd had since Wax's text had woken her at 4:52. They built a response to the medical board complaint that was comprehensive and sequenced and cited the charting system logs at every point where the fabrication claim was supposed to apply. They documented the timeline of Holloway's complaint, his attorney's complaint, and Price's suspension filing, showing the sequence in a way that made the coordination visible. Reyes filed a motion for an emergency protective order over Emily's clinical records before 7:30. At 8:10, Ferris knocked on the conference room door. She came in and sat without preamble. "Brenda Calloway," she said. Emily looked at her. "Tell me." Her husband, Raymond Calloway, worked in the county procurement office for 16 years. He retired 14 months ago, 2 weeks after the federal investigation into the Garrett contracts was opened, which he could not have known about because it wasn't public. "We think someone told him." She set a printout on the table. Raymond Calloway received a direct payment of $42,000 from a county vendor connected to Garrett's construction network, listed as a consulting fee, 8 months before he retired. The conference room was quiet. "Brenda knew," Emily said. "We don't know exactly what Brenda knew and when. What we know is that she was in a position to flag your documentation to someone connected to Garrett's network, and the timing of certain events suggests she did." Ferris tapped the printout. "This isn't enough on its own, but it's enough to bring her in for a formal interview." "When?" "This morning. Wax is coordinating with the county sheriff's office, not the East Precinct, obviously, for a cooperative interview." A pause. "She doesn't know yet." Emily thought about the supply corridor. Be careful, Emily. The specific warmth of it, the specific irony of it now. She didn't feel the anger she'd expected. She felt something tireder and more complicated. "She was never warning me," Emily said. "She was tracking me." "Probably both," Ferris said, not without a certain flat compassion. "People in complicated situations do complicated things. That doesn't change what she did." Reyes was already typing. "Does this affect the medical board complaint?" If Calloway provided false information to support that complaint, yes, significantly. Ferris looked at Emily. "I need you to stay in this building today. Don't leave. Don't interact with clinical staff beyond what's necessary, and let Reyes manage the formal responses. The protective order on your records is being processed now. By this afternoon, Carr's strategy loses its structural support." "And Price?" Emily asked. Ferris and Reyes exchanged a look. "Price filed a suspension in response to an external complaint," Ferris said carefully. "Whether he was coordinating with Carr or genuinely responding to institutional pressure, we don't know yet. Either way, his position gets complicated very quickly once the board complaint collapses." Emily nodded. She understood what wasn't being said, which was that Price might be a participant or might be a man who'd made a self-protective decision without understanding how far the water he was stepping into actually went. The distinction mattered legally. It didn't change much practically. She sat in that conference room for the next 3 hours while Reyes worked and Ferris came and went with updates that arrived in increments rather than revelations. The protective order was granted at 9:40. At 10:15, the state medical board's investigator, a man named Pollard, who came in person rather than by phone, which was unusual, met with Reyes for 20 minutes, and left with a copy of the full charting system logs showing unaltered system-generated timestamps on every entry the complaint had cited. Pollard came back at 11 and asked to speak with Emily directly, with Reyes present. The complaint as filed contains several factual claims that don't align with the system documentation we've reviewed, Pollard said. He was precise in the way of someone who'd been doing this a long time and had learned not to lead with conclusions. I want to give you the opportunity to walk me through the records directly. She did. She was calm and specific and answered exactly what was asked, and when something required context, she gave it without editorializing. She could feel Reyes tracking each answer and not intervening, which meant she was staying in the lane that needed to be stayed in. At the end, Pollard said, "The complaint will be suspended pending further review of its origins." That's not a full dismissal. I want to be clear. But it means the suspension of your privileges at this facility cannot be sustained on the basis of an unverified complaint. I'll be contacting hospital administration directly. Emily said, "Thank you." Pollard left. Reyes allowed herself a small expression of something that was almost satisfaction before she went back to her laptop. The next piece arrived through Wax, by text, at 12:32. Calloway interview completed. She cooperated. Full statement given. Her husband directed her to monitor your documentation and report any escalation. He has been in contact with Carr's office for 6 weeks. She did not know about the medical board complaint specifically. She says she thought it was limited to the hospital's internal process. Emily read that and thought about it. Did not know. Maybe, maybe not. The question of what Brenda had told herself versus what she'd understood wasn't one Emily was going to be able to answer from a conference room. She thought about 19 years. She thought about the way Brenda had stood at the nursing station and gone very still during the confrontation with Holloway, and the way Emily had read that stillness as solidarity, or at least as neutral. She'd been wrong. She was occasionally wrong about people. That was a human condition, not a flaw unique to her, but it cost something to acknowledge it. She texted Wax back. Does her cooperation change her exposure? His response? Reduces it, doesn't eliminate it. That's for the DA to determine. Fair enough. At 1:15, Price appeared in the conference room doorway. He looked like a man who had received several pieces of information in rapid succession and had not yet settled on a posture that adequately responded to all of them. He looked at Emily, then at Reyes, then at the door. "Can I speak with Ms. Carter privately?" he said. "No," Reyes said without looking up. He came in anyway and sat in the chair across from Emily. Reyes made a point of keeping her eyes on her screen. Emily waited. "The board investigator contacted me," Price said, "about the suspension. I assumed he would." "Emily," he stopped. Tried a different start. "I filed the suspension because there was a formal complaint and the hospital's protocol requires a response to formal complaints. I wasn't..." He stopped again. "I wasn't aware of the full context." She looked at him. "Were you aware of any of it?" "I knew Holloway was unhappy with the documentation. I knew Carr had been in contact with hospital administration. I didn't know..." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know where it was going." "But you filed at midnight," she said. "The complaint came in and you filed 4 hours later in the middle of the night." He didn't answer that. The non-answer was itself an answer. "Dr. Price," Reyes said, still not looking up, "I'd strongly suggest that you consult with the hospital's own legal counsel before continuing this conversation." He stood. He looked at Emily once more, and in his face was something she hadn't seen there before. Not guilt exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it. Something that was recognizing a distance between the person he'd thought he was and the sequence of decisions he'd actually made. "I'll have the suspension formally withdrawn," he said, "by end of day." He left. The door closed behind him. Emily sat quietly for a moment. Reyes finally looked up. "That was something," Reyes said. "Yeah. He'll withdraw the suspension because he's been told it won't hold, and because sustaining it now increases his institutional liability. Don't read more into it than that." "I'm not," Emily said. She wasn't, but she was noting it. The specific quality of a man who'd convinced himself that going along was different from participating, confronting the evidence that it wasn't. That was its own kind of accountability, slower and quieter than the other kind, but not nothing. The afternoon moved. At 2:40, Ferris came back with the kind of expression that meant the next thing she said was going to be significant. She sat. She put a folder on the table, which was becoming a recurring gesture in Emily's week. Philip Garrett was arrested at 11:15 this morning, she said. Federal charges: bid rigging, extortion, obstruction of justice. 4 other individuals connected to his construction network were arrested concurrently. She paused. Vincent Carr, Holloway's attorney, is under investigation for suborning false statements in connection with the medical board complaint. That's separate from the county matter, but connected. Emily said nothing. Holloway himself, Ferris continued, has been formally charged with civil rights violations under federal statute, illegal detention, excessive use of force in 3 documented cases, and tampering with his own body camera during the traffic stop. That last one carries its own charge. He was booked this morning. The conference room held that information for a moment. The body camera tampering, Emily said. They can prove it was intentional? The camera has a malfunction log. It shows the device was manually deactivated, not that it failed. The 14 seconds of footage are time-stamped in a way that confirms he turned it off after he'd already made the stop. Ferris looked at her directly. Your audio recording is the only complete record of that stop, which means your voice and his are the evidentiary center of the tampering charge. She thought about sitting in the gas station lot at 1 in the morning, uploading a file to a server she didn't control, adding a note with his badge number. She thought about how many times in the weeks before that she'd written things down simply because writing things down was what she did. Because she'd learned in places and circumstances that had nothing to do with Montgomery, Oregon, that the record was sometimes the only thing that outlasted the moment. What's the timeline on the charges? She asked. Garrett's arraignment is Friday. Holloway's is Thursday. The DOJ case will take longer to fully adjudicate. These things always do. But the structural exposure is locked in now. Ferris closed the folder. The county commissioner who rubber-stamped Holloway's conduct for 2 years is in federal custody. The attorney who tried to bury a federal witness through a professional license complaint is under investigation. The officer who thought pulling you over on a dark road was going to communicate something useful is charged with 3 federal civil rights violations and evidence tampering. She paused. That's not everything, and it's not fast, but it's real. Emily looked at the table. She was tired in a way that was below the surface, the kind that came from sustained alertness rather than exertion. The hospital, she said. Havenbrook's administration has been cooperative since approximately 10 a.m. They lawyered up, which is what institutions do, but their counsel is smart enough to understand that resistance at this point increases exposure. They're treating it as a systemic failure to protect a reporting employee, which is the framing that minimizes their liability. Ferris's tone was dry. The complaint against you has been formally withdrawn. Your suspension will be reversed in writing before 5 p.m. And my documentation? Permanently sealed from internal alteration under the protective order, chain of custody maintained by the DOJ. A pause. Emily. It held. All of it. 8 months of writing things down because you were trained to write things down. It held. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was thinking about a woman in scrubs in a parking lot at 12:40 in the morning, tired after a double shift, sitting in her car and doing the 30-second inventory. Hands, breath, position. She'd been doing that check for so long she didn't know how to stop. The particular version of alive she'd learned to be in places that required it had never entirely left her, and tonight she was sitting in a conference room in a quiet county hospital, thinking that maybe it wasn't supposed to. What happens to Brenda? She asked. That's the DA's call. Her cooperation will be weighted. The knowing versus unknowing question, whether she understood the full scope, affects charging decisions. Ferris met her eyes. I know that's not a clean answer. No, Emily agreed. Nothing about today was clean. That was what truth looked like in practice. Not a sweep, not a decisive moment, but a series of things that held up under scrutiny while other things didn't, and the slow, unglamorous work of demonstrating the difference. She'd spent 2 days in rooms, talking, documenting, being precise, resisting the pull toward either performance or collapse. The cases were moving, the charges were real, the names that needed to be on paper were on paper. It wasn't the same as standing in an empty corridor at 2 a.m. wondering who she could trust. But it was the thing that came after that. At 4:30, she walked out of the conference room for the first time in hours. The hospital had resumed its ordinary operations around the extraordinary events of the last 12 hours in the way hospitals always did, because there were still patients and there were still shifts, and the machinery of care didn't stop for federal investigations. She walked to the water fountain near the stairwell and drank from it and stood for a moment looking at the hallway she'd walked dozens of times. Her phone buzzed. Not Wax, not Ferris, a number she didn't have saved, but she recognized the area code. She answered. "This is Sergeant First Class Anthony Ruiz," said the voice. It was steady and deliberate in the way of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, but was still nervous about saying it. "I don't know if you remember me. About 8 years ago, in a transport vehicle." She stopped walking. "I remember you," she said. A long exhale on the other end. "Colonel Briggs told me you'd agreed to the documentation. I wanted you to know that we've been looking, me and Delgado both. We've been looking for a long time." She leaned against the wall. Around her, the hospital moved. Someone pushed a cart. The PA system called something. She was standing in a corridor in Oregon, listening to a voice she hadn't heard in 8 years. And the distance between then and now felt both enormous and very small. "How's Delgado?" she asked. "Good," Ruiz said, and his voice had something in it that was almost a laugh, the relieved kind. "He's good. He's got 2 kids now. He'll want to talk to you, when you're ready." "Yeah," she said. "Okay." She stayed on the wall for another moment after the call ended. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the end of the hall, and it was doing something ordinary to the linoleum that she couldn't have described but noticed. She pushed off the wall and went back to the conference room to collect her things, and she was almost there when her phone buzzed again. Wax, this time. "One more thing. Check your email. It came through DoD channels an hour ago, but Briggs held it until the Garrett arrest was confirmed." She opened her email standing in the hallway. The message was from a military address she didn't recognize at first. Then she read the signature block and went still. It was from the 2-star general currently serving as advisor to the DoD Oversight Panel on the county infrastructure investigation. She read it twice. It was formal and brief, and it contained, in its 3rd paragraph, a sentence that asked whether Master Sergeant Emily Carter would be willing to be formally reinstated to inactive reserve status in order to receive a commendation citation that the 10th Special Forces Group had been seeking to award for 8 years, pending confirmation of the recipient's identity. She stared at her phone. She thought about the photograph in Briggs's folder, the grainy image of a woman kneeling between 2 stretchers with her hands occupied. She had not known it existed. Someone had taken it and kept it, and it had been in a folder for 8 years, which meant the record of that night had existed all along, in hands she hadn't known about, waiting for a chain of events she couldn't have predicted to connect it to her name. She was still looking at the email when Reyes appeared at the end of the hallway. "There you are. You need to come back. Holloway's attorney, not Carr, a different one, just sent a letter to the hospital claiming Emily Carter improperly influenced a minor patient's testimony and is requesting access to Bayfor's records from this morning." Emily looked up from her phone. Dara Webb was never a witness in any proceeding. She was a medical patient. Her records are protected. "I know. That's what we'll file." Reyes looked at her. "Are you all right?" Emily looked at the email one more time, then she put her phone in her pocket. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." They walked back down the hall together, and the afternoon light was still doing that ordinary thing to the linoleum, and from somewhere in the building the PA system called another code that resolved before anyone had to run. The new attorney's letter was aggressive and thin, and cited 2 cases that didn't apply. Reyes dismantled it in writing in under 40 minutes and filed the response with the hospital's legal office. Emily sat across the table and reviewed the language and suggested 2 changes that Reyes incorporated without argument. At 5:47 p.m., the formal written reversal of Emily's suspension arrived from Haven Brooks administration. It was 4 paragraphs, institutional in tone, and it said that the suspension had been initiated in error based on a complaint that had not been properly verified and was now formally withdrawn with no adverse record attached. Reyes printed it. She handed it to Emily. "Frame it or don't, but keep it." Emily folded it once and put it in her bag. She thanked Reyes. She walked through the hospital and out through the ambulance bay. She'd come in that way, and she'd leave that way, a small, private continuity, and into the early evening, which was cooler than the morning had been, and smelled of cut grass from somewhere beyond the lot. She sat in her car for the 30-second inventory. Hands, breath, position. She was about to start the engine when she noticed the folded paper on her passenger seat. Not the suspension reversal. She'd put that in her bag. This was something else. A sheet of notebook paper folded in quarters that hadn't been there this morning. She picked it up and opened it. It was handwriting she recognized. Brenda Calloway's, which she'd seen on nursing notes for 8 months. Slanted, economical, slightly cramped in the letters. It said, "I knew what Raymond was asking me to do. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone. I know that was wrong. I'm sorry. That was it." No name at the bottom. No defense. No explanation beyond the small one. No request. Emily sat with it for a long moment. Outside, the lot was emptying in the gradual, uneven way of hospital parking lots at shift change, cars pulling out in ones and twos, the light going gold at the edges. She folded the note back along its original creases and put it in the bag beside the suspension reversal. She started the car. She was pulling out of the lot when her phone buzzed one more time, and the name on the screen made her brake in the middle of the exit. It was a number she'd called exactly once, from a diner at 1 in the morning, when a text from a lieutenant colonel she hadn't spoken to in years had told her something important was happening, and she needed to decide how to respond. It was Wax. She answered. "Emily," he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it through any of the previous conversations this week. "Careful. Something below the careful. I need you to stay on the line. Don't go home tonight." She put the car in park. "Why?" "Because we just pulled the financial records from the Garrett network," he said, "and there's a payment we can't account for. It went to an account registered to a shell company, and the shell company's registered agent." A pause. "Emily, the registered agent on the shell company is your name." The parking lot was very still around her. "That's not possible," she said. "I know." His voice was steady, but underneath it was something she recognized from the moments before situations got drastically worse. "That's why I need you to stay on the line, because whoever built this, they built it before Garrett was arrested, before we pulled the records, before any of this week happened. This wasn't reactive. This was prepared in advance." She looked through the windshield at the exit she hadn't quite reached. The road beyond it, and the direction home, and everything she thought had been resolved settling into a new and different shape. "Someone knew," she said slowly, "that if the investigation ever got close enough, they'd need to redirect it." "Yes. And they built a redirect using my identity." "Yes." He paused. "Emily, someone in this county has been planning for the possibility of you becoming a problem for a long time. Before the Webb case, before Holloway, before any of it." She sat with that. The engine was running. Her hands were on the wheel. She was thinking about 8 months of keeping her head down. 8 months of thinking she was watching a situation rather than being inside one. And the specific cold feeling of understanding that the perimeter of a problem was much larger than she'd been able to see. "How long?" she said. "The shell company was registered 14 months ago," Wax said. 14 months ago, 2 months before she'd arrived in Montgomery. Someone had been waiting for her before she'd even gotten here. 14 months, she said again, not as a question, just to hear it outside her own head. "Yeah." Wax's voice was even, but she could hear the effort behind it. "The company is called Meridian Medical Consulting, LLC. It's registered in Delaware. The registered agent listed is Emily A. Carter, with your date of birth and a social security number that matches yours." She didn't say anything for a moment. The engine was still running. The exit was still 12 feet ahead of her. She put the car back in park and killed the engine because she needed the silence. "Who has access to that information?" she said. "My DOB, my SSN? That's not public record." "No, it's not." A pause. "There are limited channels through which someone could obtain it. Military records, VA system, federal contractor databases. Someone with access to one of those systems, or someone who paid for access to one of those systems." He paused again. "Emily, we need you somewhere safe tonight while we pull this apart. Can you go somewhere that isn't your home address?" She thought about it. She had a small, practical list of options, and none of them were comfortable to consider. "I can. Don't tell me where on this line. Call Ferris on her direct number. She'll coordinate." "Wax." She stopped. Started again. "This was built before I got here. which means someone knew I was coming to Montgomery before I did, which means, which means this goes somewhere we haven't looked yet, he said. I know, we're looking. She hung up. She sat in the car in the emptying lot and thought about 14 months ago, which was when she'd accepted the Havenbrook position. The offer had come through a standard recruitment firm, a phone interview with Price, a background check, the paperwork of a normal lateral move. She'd thought nothing of it. She'd wanted to be in the Pacific Northwest. She'd wanted a facility with a trauma volume that would keep her skills current. She'd wanted, in some way she hadn't fully examined, to be somewhere that didn't already know her. Someone had known she was coming anyway. She called Ferris. Ferris picked up on the second ring and didn't waste time. I heard. We're pulling the Delaware registration records now. Get off hospital property. Don't go home. Do you have somewhere? Yes. Call me when you're there. She drove to her colleague Judith Marsh's apartment, a fellow trauma nurse she'd had coffee with twice, and trusted in the specific, limited way you trusted people you worked alongside without knowing well. He had notarized a fraudulent LLC with Emily's identity as the registered agent 14 months ago, which was 12 months before his wife had started monitoring Emily's documentation at Havenbrook. This wasn't opportunistic. This was a system. Garrett's network had identified potential exposures, built preemptive redirects into the financial structure, and positioned an asset inside the hospital before any specific threat had materialized. They hadn't targeted Emily because she was a problem. They targeted the position she'd fill because anyone competent enough to occupy a trauma nursing role at Havenbrook was eventually going to see what she'd seen. The difference was that most people would have let it go. Brenda had banked on that. So had whoever had designed the redirect. They hadn't accounted for what Emily actually was. She texted Ferris back. Does this connect Calloway directly to the Garrett indictment? Ferris responded immediately. Yes. His attorney was notified an hour ago. He is expected to cooperate in exchange for a reduced charge. Brenda Calloway's cooperation agreement is being revised to reflect the expanded scope of her husband's involvement. Emily looked at that message for a long time. Then she put the phone down and went to sit back in Judith's spare chair and close her eyes, not to sleep but to let the shape of everything rest for a moment without her trying to do anything about it. At 7:15 the next morning, she drove home. Gray was fine. The house was exactly as she'd left it. She showered, changed, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the neighbor's roof while she drank it. And the morning was ordinary and cool and asked nothing of her. Ferris called at 8. Raymond Calloway was formally arrested at 6 a.m. on charges of identity fraud, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and accessory after the fact to the civil rights violations connected to Holloway's conduct. He cooperated fully in exchange for a plea arrangement. The plea includes testimony against Garrett's network in the civil rights case. She paused. The fraudulent LLC has been formally dissolved. Your name has been removed from all associated documents, and a federal correction notice is being filed with the Delaware Registry. Your credit record and legal record are being reviewed for any secondary impacts. Emily said, Thank you. There's more. Holloway's attorney, Carr, not the second one, has been referred to the State Bar for professional conduct review in connection with the false witness intimidation strategy. The medical board has formally closed the complaint against you with a finding of no basis. Another pause, and this one had a different texture. Emily, it's over. She held the phone and looked at the window. Over. She turned the word over in her mind the way you turn something over to check all its sides. Over didn't mean it had never happened. Over didn't mean the weeks of it had been easy or that the cost of it had been nothing. Over meant the structural pieces were in place, the record was what it was, and the people who had tried to make the record say something else were now part of a different record. What about the shell company? She said. The money that moved through it. Forensic accountants are tracing it. It connects to 2 other fraudulent entities in the Garrett network. The money wasn't yours. It passed through the LLC without your knowledge using your identity as cover. The federal record will reflect that clearly. Ferris's voice was precise and also, underneath the precision, slightly warmer than usual. You didn't do anything wrong. I want to say that directly. You didn't do anything wrong at any point in this. Emily didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the moment in the parking lot when Wax had called and told her about the shell company and the specific quality of that particular kind of accusation. The kind you can't immediately disprove because the paperwork says your name and your name is your name. She'd felt it in her stomach the way she'd felt very few things in her adult life, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "I know," she said finally. "Okay." A pause. "Briggs wants to speak with you today when you're ready, and Sergeant Ruiz has been calling our office. Something about 2 other people who want to reach you." "Delgado," she said, "and someone named Morse. I didn't catch the rank." She remembered Morse. Private first class. 22 years old. A kid from somewhere in Tennessee who had been stabilized in a vehicle with 2 other casualties while Emily had worked without the equipment she needed for 23 minutes straight. She'd thought about whether Morse had made it more times than she'd counted. She'd told herself she didn't know because she hadn't known, and not knowing was better than assuming the worst. "Tell Ruiz I'll call him today," she said. She did. She sat at the kitchen table with Gray in her lap. He'd finally permitted this, after 3 months of strategic indifference, and she called Ruiz, and Ruiz put her on speaker, and Delgado's voice came through slightly distorted and entirely real, saying, "Carter, Carter, is that actually you?" With the kind of disbelief that sounded like relief that had been held for a very long time. She said yes. She said it was her. Morse was on the line too. He was 29 now, 7 years out of service, working in logistics in Nashville. He didn't say much, neither did she. But he said, "I've been wanting to say thank you for a long time," and she said, "You don't owe me anything," and he said, "I know, I want to anyway." And she let him, because some things needed to be said regardless of whether they were owed. The call lasted 40 minutes. She didn't know where the time went. When she hung up, she sat for a while with her hand on Gray's back and let him purr against her palm. Then she got up and went to work, because she had a shift at 10. The weeks that followed had none of the drama of the week that had preceded them, which was appropriate. Reality didn't sustain dramatic register indefinitely. What it sustained was consequence, slower, less cinematic, but more permanent. Philip Garrett was arraigned on a Friday morning in a courtroom that had more people in the gallery than it usually saw for county-level proceedings. The charges: bid rigging, extortion, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, civil rights violations by proxy, were read into the record by a federal prosecutor in a voice that was deliberately flat, the way federal prosecutors' voices were when they wanted the weight of the charges to speak without assistance. Garrett's attorney entered a not guilty plea. Garrett himself sat at the defense table in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent and stared at a point on the wall just above the judge's head, and he did not look at the gallery. Emily was not in the gallery. She was at Havenbrook at 10 in the morning, processing a chest trauma case from a construction accident on Route 9, which was where she was most days and most usefully placed. She heard about the arraignment from Ferris by text during her lunch break. Not guilty plea, as expected. Trial date set for 7 months out. The cooperation agreements from Calloway and 2 other defendants make conviction very likely. You will be called as a witness. She texted back, "I know, I'll be there." Derek Holloway's arraignment happened the following Thursday. He did not enter a not guilty plea. His new attorney, not Carr, who was managing his own difficulties, had apparently advised him to consider his options more carefully, and by options the attorney meant the body of evidence that included a forensic analysis of his deactivated camera, Emily's 4-minute 40-second audio recording, the testimony of Marcus Webb, the testimony of the teenage girl from 3 weeks before Webb, and 7 other individuals who had come forward after Holloway's suspension became public. 7. Emily had known about 2 of them. The other 5 had been waiting for a moment when it seemed like talking might do something other than create additional problems for themselves. Holloway pleaded guilty to 2 counts of civil rights violations under federal statute and 1 count of evidence tampering. He was sentenced 8 weeks later to 31 months in federal prison, forfeiture of his law enforcement certification in the state of Oregon, and a civil liability judgment in favor of 4 of the complainants that his pension would spend years paying. The sentencing was reported in the local paper in a story on page 4, which was the appropriate page for it, not the front. Emily read it in the break room between patients and then put the paper in the recycling bin. Vincent Carr surrendered his law license on a Tuesday without going through the formal hearing, which his attorney had apparently advised was the less damaging option given the evidence the state bar had assembled. The bar's published finding described his conduct as a deliberate and calculated attempt to intimidate a material federal witness through weaponization of professional licensing mechanisms. which was precise language for a finding of that kind, and which would follow his name in any future legal context indefinitely. Raymond Calloway pleaded guilty to identity fraud and conspiracy charges and received an 18-month sentence with 3 years probation. His cooperation agreement required full financial disclosure and testimony in the Garrett trial, which he provided. Brenda Calloway was not charged criminally. The DA's office determined that her knowledge of her husband's specific actions was incomplete, that her cooperation had been immediate and substantive, and that prosecution would not serve the public interest given the circumstances. She resigned from Havenbrook 2 weeks after Holloway's arrest. Emily heard, through Judith, that she had moved to be closer to her daughter in another state. Emily thought about the note left on the passenger seat, folded in quarters, in Brenda's cramped handwriting. She thought about it without resolution, which was where it was going to stay. Price did not resign. He remained as ER attending, which Emily had mixed feelings about that she mostly kept to herself. The hospital's internal review found that he had filed the suspension based on an unverified complaint without conducting adequate due diligence, which constituted an administrative failing rather than deliberate misconduct. He received a formal written reprimand and a requirement for additional training on personnel protocol. He and Emily worked together after that with the careful, specific professionalism of two people who understood they'd shown each other something in the middle of a crisis and were navigating what that meant in ordinary time. He deferred to her clinical judgment on law enforcement adjacent cases in a way he hadn't before. She didn't comment on it. That was its own kind of reckoning, and it was his to carry. The commendation ceremony took place on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after Holloway's sentencing, in a room at the Montgomery County Veterans Center that was too small for the number of people who showed up and handled the overflow with folding chairs arranged in irregular rows that gave the whole thing a slightly improvised quality that Emily actually preferred to the alternative. Briggs was there. Wax was there, which had required a flight from Fort Bragg. Ruiz and Delgado were there in person. She'd seen Delgado's face across the room before the ceremony started and found, unexpectedly, that she had to look away for a second to get herself together, which was not something she'd anticipated. Morse had sent a video message played on a laptop because he couldn't make the trip, and his face on the screen was slightly pixelated and entirely earnest, and she was glad for the people between her and the laptop, so no one could see her face when it played. Ferris was there in a civilian blazer, standing near the back with the expression of someone who didn't usually attend events like this, but had made an exception and wasn't performing the exception. The formal commendation citation was read by a 2-star general Emily had never met in person, whose name she'd seen only on the email that had found her standing in a hospital hallway. The citation described, in the careful language of official military documents, a field medical intervention conducted under hostile conditions in which Master Sergeant Emily Carter had stabilized 2 critically wounded soldiers using improvised techniques when standard equipment was insufficient, and had continued treating casualties without ceasing for 23 continuous minutes while the situation around her remained actively dangerous, and had transported both patients successfully to a forward medical station where they received further treatment and survived. 23 minutes. She hadn't remembered the exact number until she heard it read aloud. The general presented the Army Commendation Medal with Valor device. Emily accepted it with both hands, which was not the standard presentation hold, but she wasn't sure she trusted one hand at that particular moment, and the general didn't correct her. Afterward, in the room that was still crowded with people eating from a catering spread that someone had organized with more enthusiasm than coordination, Wax found her by the window. "How are you doing?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." He nodded. That was one of the things she'd always appreciated about Darnell Wax. He accepted honest answers without trying to replace them with more comfortable ones. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been in this work for 26 years. I've seen people with your kind of record spend their whole careers trying to get noticed. You spent yours trying not to be." He looked at her with something that was close to affectionate. "You are terrible at it." She almost laughed. "Apparently." "The offer stands," he said. "If you ever want to come back, advisory capacity, training, anything, the door is there." She held that for a moment. 8 months ago, she would have said no before the sentence was finished. Now she wasn't entirely sure, which was its own kind of information. "I'll think about it," she said. He seemed to understand that this was different from the no it would previously have been. Ruiz found her 20 minutes later, near the folding chairs. He He was taller than she remembered, or she'd misremembered, which happened with people you'd known in specific circumstances. He shook her hand and then, because the handshake seemed insufficient for what they'd both been carrying for 8 years, held on to it for an extra second. "Delgado wants a photo," he said. "He's being weird about asking." "Tell him to stop being weird," she said. They took the photo. Delgado's expression in it was the particular expression of someone who had wanted something for a long time and wasn't quite sure what to do now that they had it, which was an expression Emily recognized because she'd been wearing a version of it all morning. The Havenbrook contingent arrived midway through the reception, which Emily hadn't expected. 6 nurses from the trauma floor, organized by Judith, who had apparently circulated a sign-up on a group chat and driven a van. They came in slightly breathless, still in their street clothes, some of them with hospital lanyards still around their necks. And when they found Emily near the refreshments table, there was a moment of uncertain collective motion before Judith simply hugged her, which resolved the uncertainty for everyone else. "We should have done more," Judith said into her shoulder. "You didn't know," Emily said. "Some of us knew something was off." "I know." Emily stepped back. She looked at the group of them, people she'd worked beside for 8 months, people she'd been politely professional with and nothing more, people who had come to a Saturday morning veteran ceremony because Judith had sent a message and they'd all said yes. "I know," she said again, and meant it differently the second time. The hospital had offered her a formal apology in writing, which Reyes had negotiated to include a specific clause acknowledging retaliatory action in connection with the Holloway complaint. It was legally significant. It was also, in a different and smaller way, the institution admitting to her directly that what she'd known about herself all along was correct. She'd made the right calls, she'd done the right things. The record said so now in a way that could not be altered. 3 weeks after the ceremony, the state's nursing board contacted her with an invitation to participate in a working group on clinical documentation practices and nurse protection protocols in law enforcement-adjacent medical settings. The invitation cited her case specifically, not by name in the public communication, but she was told privately that her experience had been the direct prompt for the working group's formation. She said yes. She also said yes several weeks later to a different request from the hospital's director of nursing education, who asked whether Emily would be willing to develop and lead a training module for new trauma nurses on documentation practices, evidence preservation, and professional conduct under institutional pressure. The director framed it carefully, acknowledging that it was a significant ask, that Emily was under no obligation, that the hospital understood she had reason to feel complicated about the institution. Emily thought about it for 3 days. She thought about Dara Webb keeping her eyes on her own hands. She thought about Marcus Webb taking a hospital card without looking at it. She thought about 7 people who had been waiting for a moment when talking might do something, and who had found that moment when someone else had already made it real enough to step into. She said yes to that too. She stood in front of the first cohort of nursing students 2 months later in a conference room at Havenbrook, a different conference room than the one where she'd spent 2 days with attorneys and federal agents, a larger one on the ground floor with windows that looked onto the parking lot. 12 students, ranging from 23 to 41, representing the specific variety of reasons people came to nursing from different directions and arrived at the same commitment. She stood at the front of the room without notes, because she didn't need them, and she looked at them for a moment before she said anything. "I'm going to tell you something that they don't put in the curriculum," she said. "Document everything, not because you expect something to go wrong, because documentation is the difference between what happened and what someone else can claim happened. Those are not always the same thing, and when they're not, the only thing that settles it is the record." A student in the second row, young, the kind of attentive that came from genuinely not knowing yet what she was going to encounter, raised her hand. "What if the institution doesn't support your documentation?" Emily looked at her. The question was the right one. It was the first real question, and it was the one that mattered. "Then you keep it anyway," she said. "You keep it clearly, you keep it contemporaneously, and you keep it somewhere the institution can't reach. Because your documentation is yours. It belongs to you before it belongs to anyone else. The record is the only thing nobody can take back once it exists." The student wrote something down. Emily didn't try to see what it was. She thought about 8 months of notes. She thought about a phone on a dashboard and an audio recording that had backed itself up to a server she didn't control. She thought about a folder with a photograph in it that someone had kept for 8 years, waiting for the chain of events that would connect it to the right name. She thought about the 30-second inventory, the one she did in parking lots and before difficult conversations, and at kitchen tables at 4 in the morning. Hands, breath, position. She'd learned it in a different life for different reasons, and she'd carried it into this one without knowing what it was going to be useful for. She knew now. There's going to be a moment, she said, looking at the room, where someone in a position of authority tells you that the right call is not your call to make, that your job is smaller than what you're seeing, that staying quiet is the same as being professional. She paused. It isn't. Professionalism is doing the right thing under pressure, even when the pressure is coming from inside the building, especially then. The room was quiet. Outside, the parking lot had its ordinary afternoon traffic. Inside, 12 people were looking at her in the way people looked at something when it was connecting to a thing they'd already suspected was true, but hadn't heard said directly. You're going to be underestimated, she said. Some of you already have been. Some of you will be in ways that surprise you by people whose judgment you'd trusted. That's going to hurt. It doesn't stop hurting just because you were right. She held the room's attention and didn't look away from it. But here's what I've learned. Quiet strength doesn't announce itself. It just keeps going. It keeps writing things down. It keeps calling things what they are. And eventually, not immediately, not without cost, eventually, the record says what's true. She stopped there. She could have said more. There was more to say about the 7 people who'd come forward, about a teenage girl who'd kept her eyes on her hands, about 2 soldiers whose names she'd known for 8 years and whose voices she'd heard for the first time again on a phone call in a borrowed apartment, about a folded note in her bag that she'd never thrown away, about the specific texture of being in a parking lot at 1 in the morning, uploading a file, and trusting that the record would outlast the moment. She didn't say all of it, some of it was hers, but standing in that room, with a medal, she still wasn't sure how to carry, and a case she was still going to testify in, and a life that had gotten dramatically more complicated before it had gotten clearer. Emily Carter understood something she hadn't been able to articulate on all those nights she'd driven home on a dark road alone. She hadn't stayed quiet because she was afraid. She'd stayed quiet because she was building something, brick by brick, entry by entry, timestamp by timestamp, a structure of truth that couldn't be torn down because it was made of things that had actually happened, documented, preserved, verified. It was the only kind of structure she'd ever known how to build. And when they'd come for it, with suspension paperwork and fraudulent LLCs, and a cop who thought turning off a camera meant turning off what he'd said, it had held. Not because she was exceptional, because she was consistent. She looked at the 12 people in front of her, who were going to go out into trauma bays and emergency corridors, and law enforcement adjacent situations, and institutional pressures she couldn't predict, and she thought, do the work. Write it down. Don't let anyone tell you that what you see isn't what you see. Okay, she said, let's talk about documentation protocol. Outside, Montgomery went about its ordinary business in the ordinary afternoon light. Somewhere in a federal detention facility, a county commissioner was preparing for a trial he was going to lose. Somewhere in the same system, a former police officer was 2 months into a 31-month sentence, and the 7 people he'd silenced were living their ordinary lives with the specific, unremarkable quality of people who have been afraid for a long time and are no longer afraid. Marcus Webb was recovering from rotator cuff surgery. Dara Webb was a junior in high school. Anthony Ruiz had texted her a photo of himself and Delgado at some kind of sporting event, both of them grinning in the particular way of people who had survived something together and were allowed to grin about it now. Gray was at home, probably on the kitchen counter despite 6 months of discouragement, waiting for dinner. Emily Carter was in a conference room, teaching. She had once been told she was just a nurse. She had decided, a long time before anyone told her that, what just a nurse actually meant, what it cost, what it required, what it was capable of when the person doing it refused to be smaller than the job demanded. She knew the answer now the same way she'd always known it. It meant everything.